friends, and welcome to another video. Have you ever wanted to add a huge amount of volume to your skirts without weighing your body down with countless layers? Well, a hoop skirt is just what you need. Hoop skirts, also known as cage skirts or crinolines, can come in as many shapes and sizes as your heart desires. The layers of steel boning help to give your skirts under the petticoats a beautiful shape while remaining flexible and easier to move around in than multi-layered skirts. In this tutorial, we will be learning how to make a basic hoop skirt with a bagged hem. I've also drawn up some size approximations for waist sizes, ranging from 23 inches up to 55 inches, but the hoops can easily be modified to make them as big or as small as you wish. Those measurements will be at the end of this video, where you can pause and screen cap the ones you desire. Alright, let's get started. To begin, we first need to gather our materials for the build. For fabric, I've decided on using cotton drill. Not only because it's strong, but because I have a mountain of it in my stash and I am trying to be better about using the fabric I already have instead of buying more. Whatever fabric you choose, make sure it's a nice, stiff, heavyweight fabric because we'll be making our waistband out of this too. And if you choose flimsy fabric, it won't be as structurally sound. For our steel boning cases, we'll be using cotton twill tape. Twill tape is very versatile, inexpensive, and great for these kinds of projects. I recommend using twill tape or any other tape that is nice and strong and won't come apart easily or stretch. Bias tape is a definite no for anything boning related, as the bias grain moves and stretches out of shape with time. Next, we want to get our steel. Hoop skirts require something called continuous steel boning, which comes in a long roll and is cut to length. Make sure you get appropriate thickness steel, because even if it's wide enough, if it's too thin, it won't be able to hold the weight of the skirts. For this crinoline, I actually had some steel in my sewing stash. Mine was 10mm steel, but usually you'd want to go for a 15mm width. This boning is plastic coated and classified as heavyweight, measuring 1.4mm thick. Not only is the strength perfect for crinolines, but also for bustles and panniers too. To cut our hoop steel, we'll need one of these. It's called, funnily enough, a steel cutting tool. These tools are very heavy duty, with a slightly serrated blade and a heavy cutting power. The regular steel cutting ends of pliers will not be strong enough for the job of cutting steel bones, so this tool is a must. To shape the ends of our steel bones, you'll need a metal rasp or file. Make sure you have a good heavy-duty tool, because you will definitely need it. And lastly, for our bones, we need to seal the ends. The easiest and quickest way for me is just to use some regular nail polish. With those first set of tools out of the way, here's what you'll need for your sewing tools. You will need the basics, which include a sewing machine, thread in a matching colour to your fabric, sewing pins and safety pins, and snips and scissors. Let's start working on the waistband. Now, there's a multitude of different ways you can make a waistband. A solid band using Petersham tape is a great quick fix. Or you can also make a band with eyelets and lace it up corset style. For this build, I have decided to make my waistband in a very simple style using my cotton drill. First, let's mark a nice straight line across the fabric grain. You want to cut it on a straight grain to avoid as much warping as possible. If you're curious about why grain is important, check out my video on fabric grain to learn more. The length of the waistband should be the measurement of your waist, with a little extra to fold over for hooks and bars. Don't make it too loose, this needs to be sitting nice and snug on your waist. Mark the width of your waistband as double, including your seam allowance. So say for example you decide to make your waistband 5 cm wide with a 1 cm seam allowance, you'd want to measure 12 cm in total. If your fabric is doubled over like mine, make sure to pin the layers together so they don't shift while you cut. Carefully cut out the waistband. You should end up with a nice long strip. Since my fabric isn't as strong as it could be, I also cut some strong interfacing for the inside. I only cut half of the waistband's width, as I only need it slightly interfaced. Before sewing anything, I like to make sure to give my fabric a nice solid press with the iron to get rid of the wrinkles and give me a solid, smooth working area. If you have iron-on interfacing like I was using, iron it onto the inside of the waistband now. Once your interfacing is in, fold the waistband in half and press it again, giving it a nice, crisp edge. Here's what I've ended up with currently. A waistband folded in half with one half interfaced. Now we want to close those raw edges inside the waistband. Now you can pin the right sides together, sew the waistband into a tube and turn it the right way around, but I prefer this way since it's faster and gets similar results. Fold the seam allowances inwards and pin them together, closing the raw edges inside of the waistband. This technique takes a little bit of getting used to, but since I don't mind the visible stitching line on the top, I prefer it. Pin all the way down until your waistband is entirely pinned. Then, carefully sew the waistband shut. I wanted to make this waistband a little bit stronger at this point, so I quilted it by sewing a few lines along its length to really keep that interfacing from moving and to strengthen the fabric sides together. This is what I've ended up with, a nice heavy-duty waistband that is thick and strong. As stated earlier in the video, I will be closing the waistband using hooks and bars. To finish off the ends of the waistband, it's a simple matter of turning down the ends once and then over again to seal the raw edge inside and to give you a nice, sturdy base to sew your hooks and bars into. Now, this is where the calculations for your waistband should matter. You should have an overlap where the hooks and bars fit into one another and the waistband still measures the waist circumference. As you can see, my overlap has quite a significant extra piece of fabric. This is because I decided to make this waistband fit my waist measurements when I'm wearing a corset. In the future, if I ever need to let the waistband out for a bigger measurement, I can always unpick this section and expand it by moving the hooks and bars. This is an optional step, by the way, so don't feel obliged to make it the same. Now carefully hand sew your closures to the waistband. The thread I'm using is tan rather than white, so it sticks out quite obviously, but I'm not fussed about it because this will be under my clothes. The reason I use this thread instead of matching white is because this is my good, strong thread that I always use for notions. I've mentioned this thread before in my previous videos, like my gift giving guide. I've had fabric fail before this thread has so much as frayed. That's how strong it is. Once your hooks and bars are in, you're done. Stick the waistband onto your mannequin and admire how strong and sturdy it is. Now let's move on to working on the bag section of the hoop skirt. The bag is a solid piece of fabric at the bottom of your crinoline that serves two purposes. The first is that it holds the bottom set of hoops, and the second is that it also prevents you from accidentally stepping through the hoops while you walk and stops you from tripping. A great innovation if ever there was one. We'll start by rolling out our fabric and getting a nice straight line drawn up on our grain. The bag can be as wide or as narrow as you'd like, but ideally it needs to be the distance between the last and the second last hoops at the hem. I measured mine to be about 20 centimeters wide with a 4 centimeter seam allowance in total, 2 centimeters on each side, so I could double fold the edges for a clean finish. The measurements of your bag should be whatever width you decide on, so in my case it was 24 centimeters wide including the seam allowance, by the length of your bottommost hoop. So for example, if your lowest hoop measures 350 centimeters, that's the length you want your bag to be, including your seam allowance to sew it into a circle. Like the waistband, we'll first cut the fabric out and then give it a good hard iron to get it nice and flat. In the end, you should have one very long, flat noodle to work with. We need to sew this long fettuccine noodle into a circle, so grab the two ends and pin them together. Now be very careful to sew the circle the right way, instead of flipping one side and accidentally creating a giant Mobius strip. Sew the ends together and finish them off however you prefer, whether it's overlocking or another method. I decided on using just a simple French seam, so all the raw edges are, once again, sealed away inside. Now, let's finish off the edges. Since we doubled the seam allowance to 4 centimeters, it's a simple matter of just folding the edge over twice and sewing that down. And now you're done! Your bag should be sewn into a big loop with nice tidy edges. Don't forget to give it another iron to get those edges nice and crisp. To insert the steels into the bag, we need to first sew some channels using our twill tape. To begin, we need to first cut the twill tape to length and then finish the ends. This is done by simply turning the ends twice to seal the raw edge inside itself. Then we'll begin by adding the first channel to the bottom of the bag. I am leaving a total of 10 cm gap between the start and the end of the channel to insert the bones into. Once you've figured out the placement of the bottom tape, pin it in place and then sew it down on either side. Make sure not to sew the ends closed though. Do the same for the top of the bag and you should end up with 2 channels on either side, ready to insert your bones into. Now, to prepare our steels, first we need to cut them into the appropriate lengths. Using your steel cutting tool, first cut the steel to size. You can also snip the edges to make them slightly more angled. Then you'll want to take your steel rasp and file away at the edges to make them nice and rounded. You don't want any sharp edges on the steel that might tear through the fabric. Here's what your hoop steel should look like after rounding the ends off. Then you want to seal off the ends of your steel. There's a few different ways of doing that. You can use a thermoplastic like Warbler, a layer of resin or epoxy, or even heat shrink tubing. But since I'm being quick and dirty, I'm just using a couple of coats of nail polish. To make your life a little bit easier, it might be a good idea to temporarily number your steels so you don't get them mixed up. Once your steel is dry and ready to go, it's time to insert them into the bag. Being very careful not to snag the fabric, gently push the steel through the twill tape channel that you've sewn. Take your time with this process. You don't want to snag or accidentally tear through your twill tape channels. Once inserted, it's time to secure them in place. I'm going to be using electrical tape. Being mindful to keep the ends taut and straight, cut small lengths of electrical tape and wind them around the ends of the steel, binding them together. I did 3 separate ties, one on either end of the steels and one between them. Once the steels are taped together, you can move them inside the twill tape channels so they're hidden from view and more secure. And that's it! Your bag should now have a steel hoop bone on either side of it. Before we assemble the crinoline, we have to first make the casings. Start out by cutting 2 lengths of twill tape for each length of your steel. So for example, if one of your steels is 2 meters long, cut 2 lengths of 2 meters in your twill tape. Cut the tiniest bit extra to finish off the edges by, you guessed it, folding the twill tape over twice and sewing the raw edge inside. Then we need to sew the 2 long twill noodles together. Put the wrong sides facing each other and pin. Then sew down each side. Now remember to make sure that you sew the channel big enough for the steel to sit in comfortably, but not too big that it'll twist in the fabric casing. You should end up with a long, flat tube. This is your hoop casing. Once you slide the steel in your casing, you need to then seal the ends together just like you did with the steels in the bag. So in my case, that was using electrical tape. Then you can sew the hoop casing shut by tacking the ends using hand stitching. You should end up with some beautifully clean, round hoops of your desired size enclosed in a cotton twill tape casing. Repeat this process until you have all of your hoops covered. Now it's the fun time. Time to attach the hoops to the hoop skirt. Now it's time to start assembling the crinoline together. First, you'll want to divide your waistband into 10. I've added pins here to show where the markings are. Next, you want to do the same with the bag, measuring the circumference and dividing it by 10. Cut 10 pieces of twill tape to a longer length than the actual skirt length and sew each of them to the 10 points on the bag. Finish off the ends by folding them down twice to seal the raw edge inside of itself. Your bag hoop should now be attached to 10 long twill noodles. Pin each of these noodles at a rough estimate on your waistband. At this point in time, you can now see how the crinoline is starting to come together. Take each of your hoops and measure them, divide the measurement by 10, and then mark each area with a safety pin. Then starting from the bottom of the crinoline, mark each tape at the same height with a pin. In my case, each of these hoops will be 10 centimeters apart from one another. We are going to attach the hoop to each of these points. Line up the pins and then pin the tape to the hoop. Then we'll sew the hoop and the tape together by hand. This process may seem a little tedious, and I absolutely admit that it is. But in this case, it's very important to be meticulous when making these measurements. This is because it's very easy to make mistakes here and sew the hoops and the tapes wrong, which will then affect the final shape of the crinoline. One hoop at a time, working your way upwards, make sure to sew the hoops at an even distance from one another. I used strong waxed thread and a backstitch to make sure each hoop was extra secure. Finally, after the top hoop, I made sure that the skirt was at a height I wanted and then cut the excess tape off. The ends of the twill tape were once again double folded and sewed by hand to the waistband. In the end, the waistband ended up not being strong enough because of the weight of the hoops, so I unpicked the top layer of tape and sewed down some Petersham as a backing behind it, before sewing the hoops back on. And here is the final look. A hoop skirt or crinoline that has a total of 7 hoops and a hem bag. And as promised earlier in the video, here are some rough measurements I drew up for hoop sizes and materials needed, depending on the size of the skirt and the waist size. Now, I'm definitely not perfect at maths, and this is just a rough guide. You may decide you'll want a smaller silhouette or an even bigger one. By all accounts, this could be entirely wrong and I don't even get it right. Whoops! I would recommend making a mock-up of the size of the final hoop you'd like by making a circle on the floor and standing in the middle of it. Then you can scale down your other hoops accordingly. To get these measurements, I based these on my own size and then scaled up and down according to the waist diameter, trying to keep the shape uniform, but once again, I'm not an expert. This crinoline is a wonderfully rigid structure without being overly heavy and still retaining a lot of flexibility and movement. This is absolutely perfect for swishing and twirling around in a giant ball gown. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. And if you'd like to see more instructional videos, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Have an amazing day and stay crafty!